as I sit here in an underground bunker, somewhere in Asia, having a grand old time. Actually, I'm not really in a bunker. Actually, you know what? I'm not really sure where I am. But that's no matter, because I'm here to share with you today 2 of my favorite interviews. For the dog days of summer, July 2024, 2 of my favorite interviews regarding the mind. Because damn it, you're not going to make $1. You're not going to make anything if you don't have your mind straight. You can have all the rules. You can have all the insights, all the indicators, all the position sizing. But if your mind is shit, you're shit. That's it. Let's jump right in. And again, if you ever have any questions for me, I'm easy to reach right here in the bunker. Michael at Covel.com. Enjoy and see you again next week. My guest today is Jack Canfield, American author, motivational speaker, corporate trainer, and entrepreneur. He is co-author of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series. 500 million copies in print, 40 languages. Wow, that is insane. That is absolutely massive numbers. I am forever honored to have so many successful, interesting guests in this show, and Jack only adds to that roster. Without any further delay, let's get into my conversation today with one of the best-selling authors of all time. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Jack, you look good, but I got to take you off video because I'm 8,000 miles away.
Okay, so we're doing audio only?
Yeah, you look good, though.
That's fine. Take me off.
You got to click on your end. There should be a little video camera and just hit that button.
There we go.
There you go. Perfect. Yeah, I'm calling you from Saigon, so I'm a touch away.
There you go. You are a touch away. How is everything in Saigon with the coronavirus and all?
It seems like Asia's got this figured out a little bit. I'm more worried about the States. I'm American, so I'm a little more worried about what's going on there.
Yeah, it's pretty ugly here. We're locked down in about 5 states. New York City, it's a total mess at the moment. I think they've had 20,000 confirmed cases, and you're not allowed to leave your house except for essential, like to go to the pharmacy or a doctor or a hospital. So everyone's learning how to do what we're doing, work from home. People are doing all kinds of webinars on Zoom. I'm amazed Zoom hasn't crashed yet.
I think my first question, just since we started on video for a second, how old are you?
I am 75 in August.
Okay, what's the secret?
What, so looking as young as I do?
Look, people, I'm not the first person to tell you this. And I like to think of myself as bringing this too, but you have a certain energy, and I know that goes all to your work and the way you live your life and all that, but it's a nice feeling to have that, and I know you have it.
I do. A lot of people say I look like I'm in my late 50s, early 60s. I would say about 3 things. Number one, I started eating very healthy and taking lots of supplements when I was in my late 20s. I got involved in the whole health food movement. Number 2, I exercise regularly, do yoga, meditate. Number 3, I've forgiven everyone in my life. Number 4, I am someone who is pursuing the things I love. I think when you're not living in resentment and frustration and blaming, complaining, but you're living a life of passion, doing what you love to do, that really helps quite a lot. And I have a great wife and great kids, so there's a lot of love in my life. And I've chosen to be loving and to be of service rather than to be in fear. So I would say all of those things probably add up. And I'd like to say it's good genes, but my younger brother looks older than I do. And my youngest brother died already. So I don't know.
There's something you said there. And look, this is going to be a conversation. I'm going to take you all over the map. But you said something there to forgiven everyone in your life. That strikes me. I see so many people that get stuck in the past because I think forgiving is ultimately about letting go and letting go of the past, living in the moment. Speak to that some.
A lot of people think if they forgive somebody, they're somehow condoning what they did. They've sexually abused me, they robbed me, they embezzled money from me, they talked behind my back, they had an affair, whatever it is. And the reality is, when you're forgiving, you're giving for yourself. You're not condoning their behavior, but you're realizing two things. Number one, this was such an important thing in my life when I realized that everybody is always doing the best they can to meet some basic need they have with the best knowledge, skills, and tools they have at the time. If somebody embezzled money from me, they were trying to maybe feed their family or whatever. At the time, they didn't have the skills to ask or to negotiate or to earn the money on their own. A gang member, when they're out there stealing your car, they didn't learn enough in school to be effective at making a living. And so they're out there wanting to be included in the gang. They want to feel like they belong. They want to be able to take their girlfriend to the movie. So this is what they do. One of the sad things about our prison system is we don't really teach people new skills and new concepts, but we punish them. And so they teach each other how to be better criminals. So for me, I realized early on, and I had a lot of things that I felt resentful for. I mean, I had a divorce where I felt like I got screwed by the justice system. I had people embezzle money from me. I had a person screw me in a real estate deal. I can go down the list. But the point being, I realized that every time you think a negative judgmental thought, especially of anger and resentment, you're actually secreting more acid into your body. And we know that your body is healthy when it's in an alkaline state, which is why I eat mostly a plant-based diet, why I do the supplements I do, why I don't want to have any of those feelings living in my body, creating cortisol, ruining my neurotransmitters and all that good stuff. For me, forgiving is a gift. And one of my friends recently said, nothing ever happens against you. It always happens for you. You think about the things that happened. My first wife kind of screwed me financially, but it forced me to get really creative about how to make more money. And as a result of that, I did really well. It's when I started doing things like Chicken Soup for the Soul, and I had to get creative. And thank God, all of those things happened. Garth Brooks has a wonderful song called Thank God for Unanswered Prayers. And he talks about in the song, he says, you go back to your high school reunion 25 years later, and that girl you had a crush on who wouldn't go out with you is now this overweight alcoholic. And you go, thank God for unanswered prayers. I think that we realize that everything really does happen for us. And if you at least leave your life from that principle, then you don't have to carry around a lot of resentment.
Before we dive into some success principles and really give people some hope for trying times, because I think there's no greater definition of trying times than right now in March of 2020. But I want to go back in time. I want to understand Jack as a young man. For example, Jack is 13, Jack at 25, Jack at 35. I want to see some of this progression. I want to understand the progression. What were you doing at 13? What was your mindset? What were you thinking?
Oh, I was a typical Midwestern kid. At 13, I was probably figuring out how to survive when my parents moved to a new part of town. I didn't know anybody. So I was just trying to be cool and have everyone like me and ride my bicycle and engage in BB gun fights and all that kind of crazy stuff you do growing up in West Virginia. Also, I was in a military school at the time. I was poor, but I had a rich aunt, and she had a son named Jack who was killed in an automobile accident. So she kind of adopted me, not to live with her, but to just kind of give me some advantages that my brothers didn't get. If my name was Bob, I might not be talking to you today. I got a good education, but I was going to a school where all the other kids, their parents were the doctors, the newspaper editor, the lawyers. My dad was selling cash registers. It was a really different world. I always felt like I was in that world, but I wasn't of that world. I didn't belong to the country club, but I got to be a lifeguard working at the country club pool. So I was in that world, but I was looked down on. So I was trying to be included. That's probably what was going on for me.
As you start to move to late teens, early 20s, were there inspirations, were there mentors, influences that ultimately ended up shaping you when you were putting together something like Chicken Soup for the Soul?
Yeah, by the time I was in my early 20s, I was going to graduate school at the University of Chicago, learning how to be a high school teacher. And I taught history for a number of years. And it was during the civil rights movement. Someone that I met at a laundromat invited me to go to Jesse Jackson's church. I thought, okay, why not? I went that Sunday, and I really got inspired by someone who was basically had a message of motivation and self-empowerment, self-responsibility for African Americans in Chicago. And it was an integrated church, although it was probably 95% Black. that was the beginning of opening up my eyes. And then the same person who I met in the laundromat invited me to go to a lecture series called Masters of Motivation or something like that. I went, and there was a guy named Herbert Otto, who was the director of the National Center for the Exploration of Human Potential. And he was saying we are only using 10% of our brain, our mind power. So I said, wow, I want to use more than that. So I went up after the talk and I said, where can I learn to do more? And he said, well, there's this growth center called Oasis in Chicago. And you could go and take workshops there. That next year, I took 17 weekend workshops. I think I paid for 10 of them, and the rest of them I just volunteered to hand out Kleenex, workbooks, clean up afterwards, whatever. I ran out of money. But I got exposed to all this human potential where we have unlimited potential. And that's where I met someone who introduced me to W. Clement Stone, who was a friend of Napoleon Hill, who wrote Think and Grow Rich. And that changed my life.
It's amazing sometimes where there's the one moment. It's not exactly one moment for you, but you can kind of bring it to one class of moments. It changes everything. It's an amazing feeling when you look back on it. And so you look back, you're like, gosh, that one moment, and it pivots and opens up the world, opens up your eyes to everything.
Yeah, I should write a blog called All Started in a Laundromat. It's like, no, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been sitting there when this guy came in and said, put your book down and talk to me.
What year would that have been, probably, roughly?
Oh, but that probably was 1968, 69, right in there.
Now, 1968 was a really volatile year for America. It was the year I was born, but I know historically that was a rough year for America.
Yeah, I think Martin Luther King was killed that year. Bobby Kennedy or Jack Kennedy was in 63, I think. There was a lot going on. I mean, I was teaching in a black school when Martin Luther King was killed, Malcolm X was killed. We had riots in our school. So yeah, there was a lot going on.
There would not have been, I'm guessing, at that particular point in time with a lot of strife and, again, that 68, 69 time period, why did you feel comfortable going to do something that probably to this day, a lot of white Americans would not want to do, would not want to go to a completely different church with a completely different group of people? What made you compelled and want to go do that?
Well, I think what preceded that was when I first got to the University of Chicago. It was a Master of Arts in Education degree. We had this orientation where they took us around to a bunch of different schools just to give us a sense of the kind of schools that were out there that we could practice teach in when we got to that level. And one of them was called Rich Township, which it really was. It was a very affluent community. Everyone was wearing nice clothes, and the school was really well equipped, and teachers were cool. And then the next school we went to was DuSable High School, which was listed as one of the worst schools in America at that time by Time Magazine. The teachers weren't that motivated. The kids were not being educated very well. There was not a lot of supplies. And something in me, I don't know what it was, said, I could really make a difference here. So when it was time to ask for our teaching assignments, I said, I would like an all-black school. And they gave it to me. So I'd had 1 year of that experience when the guy says, do you want to go to Jesse Jackson's church? So at that point, it wasn't that difficult. But I think if they hadn't had that tour, I don't think I would have chosen to go to see a black school. It was totally outside of my experience. But when I went there, and because it was part of the journey, if you will, the tour, something in me woke up.
So far, though, if I listen to your story, and obviously I read about your story to begin with, you're one of these people where an event happens that spurs you to the next event and the next event and the next event. It doesn't seem to be this great, well-laid plan. It's more like you seem to be inspired at each moment to follow the best course of action at the moment of inspiration.
I think that's really true. And I think people often ask me, what's the secret of your success? You're a multimillionaire. You've sold 500 million books. You've been in The Secret and, yada, yada, yada. I always say, I always followed my heart. I trusted my intuition. I trusted the inner guidance that I got. I was working for a training company doing very well. And all of a sudden something said, go start your own company. That was very scary. I had to borrow $10,000 from my mother-in-law just to start a company. At a certain point, I wanted to change that company, not do the same thing anymore. And when Chicken Soup for the Soul was at the height of its success, something in me said, I'm tired of this. I don't want to do it anymore. And that's when I sold that company and started the Canfield Training Group. So yeah, I think that's true. I've always the next thing that I would be exposed to or something would inspire me and I had the courage to take the risk.
I can relate to the idea of authoring a book. I've written 5. I've had pretty good sales in the hundreds of thousands, nowhere close to 500 million. But I want you to take me back in time because I think a lot of people that perhaps have either written a book or have thought about writing a book can relate to your early experience. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Chicken Soup for the Soul was not some big advance with a big publisher rollout, was it?
No, but let me take you back even further before I answer that. So in 1976, I published my first book. It was called 100 Ways to Enhance Self-Concept in the Classroom. And I had met a man named Harold Wells, who I saw something in a newsletter that I was reading, and it inspired me to connect with him. He was developing something called the Becoming Curriculum for kids in Detroit. We hit it off as friends, and I realized we were never going to get this curriculum out there at that time, but I said, let's write a book together. We did. It sold 400,000 copies, which for an education book is ridiculous. But I had a really good direct marketing guy who worked for Prentice Hall, was the publisher. But it was a lot of work, a lot of interviews, a lot of going out. And I probably did 300 workshops for teachers, spoke at conferences everywhere. And I remember my first paid speaking engagement was for $25. I drove through a blizzard into Connecticut to do a 2-hour workshop from Massachusetts, drove back through a blizzard. It's amazing I didn't die. And I got a check for $25, and I was so excited. I said to my wife, I am a paid professional speaker. So Chicken Soup came along. It's probably the second book I did, which was in 93. And as you said, we got no advance. We were rejected by 143 publishers before we found a publisher who said, well, we'll publish it. But we said, well, how many books do you think we'll sell? He said, well, 20,000 if we're lucky. And Mark Victor Hansen, my co-author, and I said, well, that's not our vision. He said, what's your vision? I said, we want to sell 1.5 million books in a year and a half. And he laughed at us. And I'm sure people listening to this have shared their dream with someone, had them laugh out loud. And he said, there's no way. I said, there's a way. He said, well, how do you believe you can do this? I said, well, we're entrepreneurial thinkers and we're visionaries and we know how to make things happen, which in fact we did. So we sold 1.3 million in a year and a half. We missed it by 200,000, but he stopped laughing. A year later, he bought a private jet based on our income.
Let me keep you at that moment for a second. The sharing the dream and receiving a laugh. I definitely can relate to that. I'm thinking about how it shaped me though. I don't know that I wanted to prove that person wrong or it really stayed with me, but they definitely left something there to where maybe it just increases the drive more. You mentioned the story with your divorce where it kind of forced you to figure out how to make money in more unique or creative ways. Maybe for me, it's when someone laughs, it forces you to say, oh, you're going to laugh? Well, I'm going to double down and really get there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are motivated by that. I don't think everybody is, but I think a lot of people, I'll prove to you that I can do it. I think for me, my drive for success came from trying to prove I was worthy. I remember not too long ago doing some sessions with some people and really getting in touch with how I remember thinking, God, I've done 200 books. Is that enough? Am I worthy now? Part of my motivation has always been to make a difference. It's very pure. It's very, very clean. But there's also been a big self-esteem issue for me most of my life. Am I worthy? Do I deserve to be successful? Have I earned my place? Do I deserve all the wealth that I have? For me, it was more like proving I'm somebody worth paying attention to. I'm somebody worth admiring. I think for other people, you tell them no, and they go, I'll show you. So we all have different things that motivate us. And at some point, we have to decommission the neurotic drive from the pure drive. I think I've done that in my life, but I'm not complaining. It got me where I am.
I like how you just said that you're kind of proposing a pivot. And I feel like I can relate to that idea where you just at some point in time, the original thought or reason that kind of pushed for the start kind of disappears. And then it becomes this drive for the art or the purity of whatever you want to create.
Right. I think our ego drives us in the beginning. I think that's pretty natural. It's part of our evolution. But at some point, you have to transcend the ego and get in touch with your true self. I was just talking to a guy the other day who's written a book about, I forget the title exactly, but I think it was called The Book of You or something like that. He was saying, he reminded me of a story that I put in the first Chicken Soup for the Soul book. And he said, you're the reason I wrote this book. And I said, tell me more. And there's a story in that book called The Golden Buddha Story. And it's a story about when I went to Thailand with my wife. We were doing some workshops for the government over there. Then we had a few days to be tourists. And if you go to Bangkok, one of the things you do as a tourist, you visit 3 Buddhist temples. And one of the temples is called the Temple of the Golden Buddha. And there's about a 10.5-foot tall solid gold Buddha worth about $196 million just if you were to melt down the gold. It said in a little box that was right next to it on the right-hand side on the wall where there was a piece of clay. It said in 1954, they did not know there was such a thing as a golden Buddha. They were moving this clay Buddha from one side of Bangkok to the other to make way for a road they were going to put through where this temple was. As they were lifting it up, it was surprisingly heavy. And the crane wasn't really expected, it wasn't ready for that much weight. And it kind of came back down on the earth and cracked. It started to rain and they put a tarp over it to keep it dry. And that night, the head monk came out and he shined a light under the tarp to see if it was staying dry. And he saw something gleamed back from inside the crack. And he knew that clay does not reflect light. So he, in the back where it wouldn't show if he was wrong, he chipped away at it and discovered this golden Buddha inside. Their best guess is that 300 years earlier, the Burmese were attacking Thailand and they were killing everyone along the way and stealing all their valuable things. And the message had gotten down to Bangkok. So they covered this golden Buddha with clay and painted it so no one would think it was valuable. They wouldn't melt it down. And here it was for hundreds of years. Nobody knew the golden Buddha was inside. The metaphor that my wife and I talked about at dinner that night was inside of each of us, there is a golden Buddha. There's a golden essence. There's a Christ consciousness, whatever you want to call it. And yet it's covered up with the clay of our conditioning, our cultural conditioning that we get that makes some people racist, and make some people not, make some people Christians and some people Buddhists and some people Muslims, because it's just the conditioning you got growing up. At some point, we're responsible for removing the clay and getting back to the original essence of who we are. And I think that's what a lot of the world is doing right now. I think even during this coronavirus pandemic that we're all in, we're starting to see that we're all really one, that we can't hide. The virus does not decide if you're rich, I'll leave you alone, or if you live in this place or you're a U.S. senator, you're good. Everybody's on the same boat. We're all on the same boat when it comes to the ecological issues we're facing with the mass extinctions we're experiencing. I think that our culture and what's happening in the world is kind of forcing us to maybe take some of this clay off a lot quicker and start loving each other and supporting each other and serving each other, as you're doing with your podcast and I do with my work.
Before I bring us up to current date and really start to open and unpack some of your work for these, quote, trying times right now, you mentioned Bangkok. I've been in Southeast Asia. I guess the first time was about 8 years ago, and I've spent the better part of 7 or 8 years, the last 7 or 8 years here. Can you speak to, as you bring up that Bangkok experience, I don't know how to describe it exactly for me, but I remember seeing some of those Bangkok temples, some of those golden Buddhas for the first time, and in other countries in Southeast Asia, etc. What is it? What is it about that when you see and feel that for the first time, for example, as an American, it really changes you, broadens you, opens you up? I still don't have my finger on it exactly, but I'm so happy to have had the initial experience and to have it change me.
Yeah, I think, one of the sad things I've learned recently is I forget the exact number, but how few Americans even have a passport. The reality is when you travel, I think Mark Twain said this way back when, Samuel Clemens, he said, when you travel, you go and your beliefs get challenged. You wake up to other possibilities. The first time I went to Taj Mahal in India, the first time I saw the golden Buddhas or the reclining Buddha in Bangkok, the first time I seen some of the temples in other Asian countries, the Chinese wall, etc. It shakes you at some level because you're just not familiar with sometimes the magnitude, sometimes the reverence, sometimes the awe inspiration that is created when you climb a mountain or you go to Machu Picchu or whatever. For me, every time I travel, I meet different people. For example, the first time I was in Singapore, I had just seen the movie Gandhi. And I was kind of embarrassed that I had mostly a British background. My grandparents were British and German. When I was seeing what the British had done to India in the movie Gandhi, I felt kind of embarrassed about it. I was saying it to this general in the Air Force who I was having dinner with in Singapore in his home. He said, "Oh, no, thank God for the British." I said, "What? Why?" He said, "We'd have no postal system. We'd have no railroad. We'd have no communication." You just keep getting opened up to new possibilities. First time I meditated in a temple in India, I got stoned, not stoned like from marijuana, but stoned in a level where I didn't know you could feel that happy so quickly with another group of people chanting some words that I never heard before. And the same thing, I've had that in Christian meditation centers and doing Sufi dancing with the Sikhs and with the Sufis, which is a Muslim tradition of spiritual growth. Each of those just opens us up to new possibilities and seeing the world through new eyes. And I think you're just more expanded, I guess would be the word.
As we expand out today, here we are. I don't know, is this going to ultimately end up being the biggest event in the last century? I don't know. The wars were pretty terrible. World War I, World War II. This economically is going to be really trying. A lot of people, I think when they post the jobs numbers, people are going to be terrible. It's going to be so many people that have perhaps overnight feel like they've lost hope. And I think the great thing about having somebody like you on my show right now is your work's about hope. If somebody's at kind of a quote bottom, or somebody's at a transition, or somebody's just feeling terrible, if they can find their way into a lot of the work that you've put together, they can really find a chance to kind of rebuild, a chance to get started again. But I think it's probably it can take an event like this to perhaps get some people over to your world. Because look, even though you've sold all those books, there's a ton of people that have never in their entire life gone down the path of understanding the messages that you've put together.
It's very true. A small percentage. I mean, they've sold 500 million books, but you got 8 billion people on the planet, and many of those books were sold to the same person. Yes, it's absolutely the case. The good news is that there's more and more people like you and me and others who are out there doing this work. There are more podcasts, more blogs, more people talking. There are more television shows like Oprah's, people talking all the time. There are these YouTube channels with all the TEDx talks and so forth. So there is a quickening of what's happening. And I think sometimes it takes people to hit bottom to realize there's a better place to be. And I think we all now are being called to step up to a new level. One of the things that I learned early on, when a recession hits, when a depression hits, when the pandemic hits, there's actually no less food on the planet than there's ever been. There's no less dollars floating around. They're still there. There's no less toilet paper, except for the fact that people have hoarded it, but there'll be plenty of toilet paper. Everything still exists. It existed the day before the market crashed. The issue is, are we willing to keep interacting with each other and finding creative ways to support each other? Can I trade for food? Can I do something for you and you do something for me? If I'm a landlord, can I say, hey, how about you don't pay my rent for the next 3 months? I'm not going to evict you. Already some governments have made it illegal. In Canada, you can't evict anyone for 6 months right now. It's illegal. In California, it's illegal to turn off the electricity of anybody. People are starting to say, look, we're all in this together. Let's work together and let's forgive each other. So if everyone plays, it works. We just put the society on pause for a little bit. In other words, I don't pay my rent. My landlord can't pay the bank. The bank says, okay, I'm not going to charge you your mortgage payments for this apartment building you own. And then the banks are going to get bailed out by the government, because they will. Everybody can say, just calm down. One of my friends came up with an amazing idea the other day. He said, how about you borrow money from the government equal to 1 year's salary? But it's a loan. And you get 1 year, 2 years, 3 years to pay it off. And you pay it off with no interest, or like 1% interest or whatever it is. But only the people who need it, not me like a millionaire, are people that are going to actually borrow it, instead of what's being proposed now, which is everyone's going to get a check for $2,000. Well, how long is that going to last? Some people's rent is more than that a month, especially if you live in New York City or Los Angeles. There's a lot of creativity that's going to come forward. We all just have to say, look, we're all in this together. Let's help each other. Let's support each other. I was excited to see someone did an article recently, 2 days ago, about some woman in Canada, that we have this term called scaremongers, people that go around and try to scare everybody. She came up with the term caremongers. And so she organized people in her neighborhood. She said, some people can't go out. They're too old, quarantined, or at least physically distancing ourselves from each other. How about some of the younger people? We get together and we go to our neighbors and we say, do you need any food? Can I go to the pharmacy for you? Is there anything you need done? Within 1 day, over 1,000 people signed up. And now nationwide, it went from one city to nationwide. Tens of thousands of people have signed up to do that. I live in a little small community called Hope Ranch, which is part of Santa Barbara, California. Already we have a community newsletter that everyone can post things in online. There have been at least 200 posts of people saying, how can I help? High school kids saying, we're out of school. We're not going to school. I don't want to do things and get in trouble. If any of you need anything done, I've now arranged 40 kids who are all willing to help out. That kind of thing could always be done. But we just have to say, let's be humane. Let's be loving. Let's be kind, and let's help each other get through this.
My audience is listening to a very calm, caring individual. You talk right now. You're talking about helping and supporting each other. However, if people hear, some people hear, not me, I love this statement, but if some people hear this statement, take 100% responsibility for your life, in a moment like right now, that could cause some people to be like, I'm not listening. That guy's crazy. Forget it. That's the wrong message right now. Speak to how it's not the wrong message and it doesn't conflict with what you've been saying for the last 30 minutes at all.
Well, to really understand that statement, you have to understand a little formula I put in the first chapter of my Success Principles book. It's also in the first chapter of the Success Principles workbook, which is my new book that's just come out. And the little formula says E plus R equals O. That stands for event plus your response, that's the R, equals the outcome that you get. We have an event now called a worldwide pandemic. The result of what I'm going to experience, the outcome of what I'm experiencing right this moment, I am 100% responsible for. In other words, basically, there's three things you can control your responses: your thinking, your images, and your behavior. So that what you think, what you picture, and what you do or say. I'm responsible for that. If I start thinking I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my house, I'm not going to be able to pay the rent, I'm going to get sick, my mother's going to die, you're going to feel crappy. If on the other hand, you say, look, I can get through this, I have the skills, the knowledge, the friendship circles, the ability to ask for what I want, the ability to negotiate, the ability to be creative, to start thinking about how can I do business from my home. For example, anyone in the business you and I are in can do podcasts online. We can do video seminars. We can do webinars. We can charge people for that. We can run multi-level businesses from home, selling all kinds of health products and essential oils and things that help build your immune system. So there's lots of different ways to become useful and to be able to make a living, even if you've lost your job as a waiter. There are other ways, there are things you can do, but you have to get creative, because the minute you go into fear, which is a choice, which is a response, you start scaring yourself by imagining terrible things. You're now in the amygdala, which is in the back of your brain, which hijacks the prefrontal cortex of your brain, which is where rational thought and creative thinking comes from. So you're not going to be able to make rational decisions. We now know in America, gun sales, just, I think it was Delaware or New Jersey, have gone up 1,400%. Meaning 1,440% more people are buying guns because they're scared people are going to run out of food and then come try to take their house and their food or their gold or whatever. That's when you're in the amygdala. You're going to make decisions that are based on fear. When you're in your prefrontal cortex, you can think rational thoughts about how can we get through this together? Where can I reach out to? How can I get what I need, etc. So basically, I'm responsible for the thoughts I think. I can think thoughts that make me feel miserable. I can think thoughts that make me feel positive. In a more calm time, I would use the example, if your husband forgets your birthday, you can think the thought, my husband doesn't love me. If he loved me, he'd remember my birthday. How does that leave you feeling? It leaves you feeling lonely, pissed off, and not that good. If you think the thought, somebody who loves me forgot my birthday, now you have some concern, but you're not feeling bad. Your self-esteem didn't go down. You're not feeling resentful. So your thoughts are one of the first things that you have control over, and we can think positive thoughts. That's why all these self-help books and podcasts and blogs and so forth are valuable to listen to. People should be listening to some uplifting messages right now, listening to the people that can keep you calm. Another thing you can do is you can visualize 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months out that your business survived, that you still have a job, you didn't lose your house, you didn't die, your kids are all well, your mom survived, etc. Because all fear comes from imagining something in the future that hasn't happened yet. Even if there was a rattlesnake or a cobra in your room, for you to feel afraid, you'd have to go into the future and imagine that snake coming around you and strangling you or biting you. That hasn't happened yet. It would be much better to be in the rational mind and say, look for exits, look for a stick, whatever. But sometimes we get so afraid, we get into fight or flight, we're not rational anymore. And then what do? Your behavior. I mean, stocking up on 9 months worth of toilet paper so that no one else has one is probably not the smartest thing to do. We know that, at least in America, the supply lines for grocery stores, for pharmacies are still very much intact, and everything's being done to keep them intact. I think that it's your responsibility to control your thoughts, control your images, and control your behavior in ways that will get you to where you want to go. I don't think it's valuable right now to be blaming the government, blaming the Chinese, as some people are doing. They're calling it the Chinese virus or the Kung flu. Those kind of things are not helpful. But I think what is helpful is to keep thinking, what will get me where I want to go? And where I want to go is thrive and survive through this.
Have you always believed it's possible, whatever it might be, or did you learn how to believe it's possible?
I learned. I grew up in a very negative family. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was an alcoholic. They blamed everything on the government, the rich capitalists, whatever it was. And so that's where I grew up. Now, I didn't really learn all this until I met W. Clement Stone. I was probably 24, something like that. It was a matter of hanging out with him and the people he hung out with, reading the books, listening to the audios and the videos, attending seminars and so forth.
To this day, I still think that's when I look at your work and I see that phrase, believe it's possible. To me, I don't know how to, look, I've not had the chance to put together the kind of work that you have done. My books have been more investing type books. But when I look at that phrase, believe it's possible, I see so many people over the last 20 years I'll come in contact with. And that seems to be the one part where they can't believe it's possible. They need some way to pull out, and you can give them a few words, you can direct them to some books, but it always just strikes me that how many people don't believe it's possible.
Well, you know what's interesting? I interviewed 75 people when I wrote the first Success Principles book. I interviewed people that were generals in the Army, people that were top salespeople, people that were Olympic and professional athletes, people that were movie stars, people like Stephen Jobs and people like that. And what happened is every one of them believed it was possible. So I thought, if you want to be successful and be one of those 1%ers or the top 3%, you got to think like they do. It's like, what thoughts are they thinking? What magazines are they reading? What books are they reading? Who are they listening to? Who are the influences in their life? And I want to get myself into that. I was just in India all of February. I went to an Ayurvedic healing center in Mumbai. My wife and I took a month off. Again, one of the reasons I look as young as I do is I do those kind of things, fasting and healing and longevity type things. Anyway, the point was there was a doctor there who was the doctor who invited me to come to this clinic, who was amazing. He was in the same lineage of doctors from the first doctor that was Buddha's physician. So for 2,500 years, they've been passing down these traditions of ancient healing. We often talk about alternative medicine. It's really allopathic Western medicine that's alternative. For 2,000 years, they've been testing all these herbs and acupuncture points and so forth that we know work. One of the things he said was when he went to work with his teacher, he said, I'll teach you, but you have to devote 1,000 days to being my student, meaning for 3 years, you have to do everything I do, drink what I drink, eat what I eat, think what I think, read what I read, meditate when I meditate, etc. And if you'll do that for 3 years, I'll teach you. Today, we all want to learn something by reading one book, listening to 2 podcasts, or watching 10 TED Talks. The reality is it takes time to get that clay off the golden Buddha that we talked about earlier. Someone once said, I love this quote, said, success is a marathon, not a sprint. And so 26 miles as opposed to a 100-yard dash takes a little time, a little commitment. But I think we all can learn to believe that it's possible. And then just recently, I wrote a foreword to 2 books. One was called From Homeless to Billionaire by a guy who arrived in Thailand when he was 22 or 3. Maybe he was 19, I think, actually. And now he's 35 and he's a billionaire 3 times over. He went from homeless, living on the beach in Phuket, to being a billionaire. And then I wrote the foreword to another book called The Billionaire's Secret, written by Raphael Bedziag from Poland, I think. He interviewed 21 billionaires. It took him 5 years to get to 21 billionaires who would actually give him this time. Every one of them, from the time they were a kid, chose to believe it was possible. And a lot of people talked about it was a choice. I just knew that if I was going to be successful, I had to believe it was possible. Because we won't do what's not possible. If I said to you, I'm going to do a seminar tonight, 10 o'clock, it's going to be online, and I will teach everyone within 1 hour how to levitate at least 1 foot off the ground for 20 minutes. No one signs up. Why? Because they've never seen anyone do it. They've never heard of anyone that could do it, and so they don't believe it's possible. And I wouldn't blame them. But the fact is, if you didn't believe it was possible, you'll never sign up. I'm not suggesting you should for that. But the point is that you have to believe it's possible, or you won't take the time to invest the time, the money, and the effort to achieve what it is you want to achieve.
This podcast that you're on right now, I think I've done 500 plus interviews in the last 8 years. There's been 6 Nobel Prize winners on here, a lot of people that you probably know personally. I want to ask you, though, as you mentioned the 75 that you spoke with, these really prominent folks, Steve Jobs is an example for the success principles. who stands out? Because there's got to be a couple that really just stand out. Not that they weren't all great and valuable, but who stands out? And what were some of those just moments where you're like, wow, something just happened there. The electricity just sparked and you were like, oh my, okay, this really grabbed me. Does anything really jump out at you of those 75?
Well, I'll share a story that jumped out at me that it was not my story. It's one from the Billionaire Secret book. But when I was reading that to write the forward, it blew me away. There was a kid in China who was not good in school. In fact, he just hated it so much he managed to get himself thrown out. He was literally, as a teenager, the only thing he could do was tend the cows in his little local rural community. At one point, he realized, I'm never going to be anything if I don't change my way. And he said, I need to study and I need to learn to read. They wouldn't let him back in school. So he would take his brother's textbook and he would have his brother teach him some words. And finally, he realized he needed to get a dictionary. He went down to the river and with a sickle, he would cut grass in the morning and then sell it to the farmers to feed to their cows like hay. It took him a year and a half to earn enough yuan in order to buy a dictionary. And then he memorized every word in that dictionary. And then he realized he needed an encyclopedia if he was really going to become educated. It took him 3.5 years to make enough money to buy an encyclopedia. And little by little, he educated himself to where eventually, I believe I have the story right, he is now one of the major manufacturers of all auto windshields in the world. And he's now a billionaire. And I thought about what kind of courage and what kind of belief it takes to know at that young age, if I'm going to be successful, I have to change my ways. I have to believe it's possible. I mean, you and I could go out now. There's a dictionary online. We have a computer. He didn't have that. But the perseverance it takes to spend 3 years just to earn enough money to go buy a dictionary. You and I will walk into Barnes & Noble or go on Amazon and buy a dictionary in a minute. That kind of story inspires me. And every story in that book was someone like that who started repairing computers and then couldn't get parts for computers. So then they had to become a parts importer. Then eventually they became the #1 computer distributor in all of Eastern Europe. Little by little, just doing the next thing, believing that if I do this and do it well, it will lead to the next thing, and then I'll be successful.
I've had the chance to be in mainland China many times. I've had a chance to walk on the Great Wall. It's a great experience, as you noted earlier. I've also had the chance to speak before. I think at one time it was a crowd of 1,500 people. For a guy writing investment books, that was pretty amazing. I've never seen anything like that. And everybody was so energized and so juiced. And I think you make a point earlier also about this time where, okay, the virus that has swept the world happened to have come from China. I do hear a lot of negative messages about China right now, and I think it's unfortunate because every time that I've been in mainland China in the last decade, all I have felt is people that just want to share with me, people that want me to see what's going on there. And I got to tell you, when you go to a place like Shanghai, as you know, oh my gosh, you're like, wow, this is crazy. The amount of human energy and achievement is off the hook. And I really do think that right now, this is a trying time, but I think people are losing sight of the fact that what's going on in China is not exactly what's going on in the media.
No. There's very little that goes on in the media that's really reflective of anything real in the world, from my opinion. I was over in Iran a couple years ago. It's considered one of the axis of evil. The Americans are not supposed to like Iran. We had a little tiff where we were sending missiles back and forth a couple months ago. Everybody there loved me. I was checking out of my hotel at 4 a.m. and to get the flight to Dubai to come home. And this young 20-year-old at 4 a.m. reaches across. He looks around and he says, "I love your country." And I said, "Really? Tell me more." "I love your music. I love your art. I love your television shows. I love your clothes." The fact is, most people just want to raise their kids. They want to have a job. They want to do well. They want to do what they love to do. They want to grow themselves. They want to not get sick and die. They want their children to be healthy, etc. It's our governments that get in the way. And then the media fans all that because whenever there's fear or panic, just like we're seeing now, that's what makes people watch. Used to say in the media, blood sells. I think the fact that most people are just humane, caring, nice people. There are some crazies out there for sure, but we know who they are. We can feel it when we get close to them. But I agree with you. I think a lot of countries and a lot of people take a bad rap, and I don't think it's good for anybody.
I would hazard a guess that right now, not because of the virus, but perhaps in spite of it, but I would think that there could be no greater opportunity for just about anything than right now. Because you mentioned the story earlier, at the very beginning about, okay, I got a divorce from my wife. It wasn't great. It forced me to rethink things. If people are truly open and let go of their prior scripts that they had planned and are open to what's right now, the possibilities that have opened because of this trying time are endless.
Mm-hmm. Just to give you an example of creativity, I was on a podcast this morning with a guy up in Canada who is an entrepreneur, and he works with entrepreneurs, and he was giving some examples of what people are doing. One guy owns a gym. He has a ton of treadmills and bicycles and spinning bicycles and all that stuff. Of course, you're not allowed to go out in the world. You can't congregate in gymnasiums. They've all been shut down in California, and spas and all this kind of stuff, workouts places. He quickly decontaminated everything, went online to all his customers and says, if you'd like to rent a bike or a treadmill or some weights or whatever, I would be glad to deliver them to your home. You'll pay a rental fee. That'll allow me to keep my doors open. I'll be able to pay my rent and so forth. When it's all done, I'll take them back and we can continue on as usual. That kind of creativity is what's being required by people now. When the first big financial crash happened in 2008, a lot of people went online on eBay to sell stuff so they could survive. This one woman realized most people had never used UPS and they'd never shipped anything bigger than maybe a box like you can carry. Now they're selling dressers and they're selling stereo systems and all that. She put an ad in the local paper and then started taking Facebook ads and Google ads. If you sell something, I'll come pick it up and I'll ship it for you, and you'll pay me a small fee for that. She made out like a bandit during that period of time by being creative. I think we're being asked to be creative. We're being asked to think outside the box. We're being asked to think, how can I partner up with people to do things? And I think we're being asked to think just in terms of how do we relate to people in general? Can we do something where we're selling from our heart, not from fear? A lot of the selling that goes on is fear-based. There's only 3 left, and if you don't buy by midnight, you're not going to be able to get the discount and all that kind of stuff. I think we need to let that go right now.
As you were giving that story about the guy in Canada, I thought to myself, gosh, I've got to give Jack one that he can pass on to the next person. Vietnam exports a lot of dragon fruit to China. But in the middle of this, the exporting of dragon fruit has basically stopped. A lot of rotting dragon fruit in Vietnam. So the enterprising bakers in Saigon have figured out that if they take the dragon fruit pulp and when they're making their banh mi bread, use dragon fruit pulp, the pink dragon fruit, instead of water, they're now ending up with banh mi loaves that have got a pink hue with a kind of aromatic fruit taste, very light, and it's delicious. And so here you have the mother of all invention. China can't buy dragon fruit right now because of this, and so they use dragon fruit for pulp to make the bread. All of a sudden, I'm sure in the not too distant future, Vietnam will become famous for its pink banh mi.
There you go. There you go. And there'll be a lot of that will happen. I think another thing too, and I would just say this not to sound self-serving, but this is a time when people are home. I teach something in the morning called the Hour of Power, for example, which is 20 minutes of meditation, 20 minutes of reading, and 20 minutes of exercise. I'm doing some fitness kind of thing. Most people are sequestered and they can't get out of their home. So now you don't have that hour-long or 2-hour-long commute in the morning, or if you add them up at the end of the day and so forth. So why not read those books you've been putting off? Why not engage in some self-reflection? Why not engage in meditation? And whether it's my book or someone else's book is irrelevant, but I think that there's so many things right now that you can do to get fitter, to develop your brain, to get some more information, to clean up some messes. One of the chapters in my workbook is clean up your messes and incompletes. My wife and I, this weekend, normally I would have been out at this fundraiser in Los Angeles helping Bob Proctor and some other people you know raise money for a foundation called Unstoppable that builds schools in Africa, but that was canceled. We've cleaned out our garage. We have gone through all of our Tupperware and made everything fit, and the things that don't have caps are going out to Goodwill. We have gone through our clothes and said, I'm never going to wear that again. So there's a lot of things you can do right now that are things you've been putting off. Spending time with your family, spending time with your kids, developing your website, writing that book you've been thinking about, putting together the outlines for the next 10 podcasts you want to do. The key thing is to look at, again, the opportunities that exist and focus on, well, I often teach this concept called turning a have to into a get to. I used to have to drive on the 405 freeway in LA. And if you know anything about that, it's 12 lanes wide. It looks like a parking lot at 5 o'clock. But I created some games I could play as I was driving home. One game was called Don't Touch the Brake. It was like golf. The low score wins, and I'm always trying to break my score. So if I drive really, really, really slow and leave enough space between me and the car in front of me, I'll never have to hit the brake. But if I drive too slow, a car is going to come in from the right side or the left side into the lane that's now got an open space in it in front of me, and I have to hit the brake. It's a fun game to play. This commute, which used to be a pain in the butt, became a fun time. Now, do you have to be sequestered or your business is not allowed to operate or whatever? Ask yourself, how can I turn this into a get to? What are the things that I get to do that I normally didn't get to do? And I think a lot of that can be very useful and helpful in terms of your income, making money. You could be studying the stock market, reading books by Ray Dalio and Tony Robbins, Unshakable, and all that kind of stuff. Don't think of this as negative. Think of it as unseen for yet positive, and start looking for the good.
I got to tell you, the one thing that I really love about the success principles, beyond the content, the heavy content of the book, but I love reading a table of contents that when you finish reading the table of contents, you're already energized to go run through a wall. I mean, right? Because I admire how much time and energy went into the table of contents. I mean, seriously. The book, The Success Principles Workbook, an action plan for getting from where you are to where you want to be. And good-looking Jack on the front cover to go along with the book, The Success Principles as well. Where can we send people, Jack? What's the best website beyond Amazon to buy all your books? But where's the best website would you like to direct people to?
Well, I think go to the successprinciplesworkbook.com and you can get some free bonuses there if you buy the book and let us know you did it. Or if you buy it through the website, ours, it'll take you to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Books A Million, whatever. You get 10 weeks of a video coaching program by me for free. You get to download the first chapter of the book when you go there and you buy it before the book will ever come to you in the mail. And also, I'm doing some live master classes where I'm teaching 2 hours from the workbook, where I'll take you through some of the exercises, literally some of the core exercises that are normally things I don't teach. I learned some amazing things in India that I'm going to share with people about how to actually activate your subconscious mind in ways that I've been teaching this for like 50 some years. And I learned some new things that I'm going to be sharing in that. That's probably the best way to go. And I would also encourage you, just go to jackcanfield.com and sign up to be on my mailing list, because I've done 3 free seminars on how to survive in a challenging time. And I'll be continuing to do that. Another thing that I'll do over the next couple of months is I'm going to do some free seminars where I take you for an hour. One of the things we know is that all your limiting beliefs, the majority of them started between the ages of 3 and 8 years old. We can go back through a technique I've learned to literally take you back to that time and get you unstuck. So the reason you're stuck and not being able to make a relationship work or get the finances you want or the job you want or whatever it is, we can literally find the limiting belief that's keeping you stuck, that's unconscious, that you don't even know you have, and we can release that belief. I did this for over 12,000 people in the month of January, just as a gift to my mailing list. The results were extraordinary. There's a number of things you can get, and you'll be on the list to receive information about that. Just jackcanfield.com.
As you note, there's no better time with all the time that we have being locked up in the house to go jump right in, right?
Exactly.
Jack, I appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. This was really fun. I had a good time. You're a good guy to just hang out and talk with.
Thank you, sir. Take care, man.
Okay, you too, buddy.
My guest today, Allison Gopnik. She's an American professor of psychology and affiliate professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. She's known for her work in the areas of cognitive and language development, specializing in the effect of language on thought, the development of a theory of mind, and casual learning. Definitely check her TED Talk out. Really interesting stuff. She starts her analysis, gets down to child development and looking at how we learn and we grow from the earliest months in our lives. And for those of you that might be thinking this is not your thing, trust me, Allison might have the most energy of any guest I've ever had on this show. And for someone that can make up the term Bayesian babies, which would be Thomas Bayes, Bayesian statistics, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Let's jump right in with my conversation with Allison Gopnik. Professor, I have to say, when I dig into your world, my first thought that I have, I want to be in your class. I'm 49 years of age. I want to be in your class. I was thinking, why do I want to be in her class? And you can just feel this insatiable curiosity. I want to know for you. This goes right to the heart of your work. Try and place for me how that insatiable curiosity began for you. Look, we're going to talk about child development today. You must have had great parents.
Yeah, well, I had a very interesting childhood and very rich and wonderful childhood. But a big feature of it was that I'm actually the oldest of 6 children. I was involved and engaged with children for as long as I can remember. And I had this wonderful bohemian 1950s, early 60s childhood where my parents were actually graduate students and then young faculty, but they were basically crazy bohemians. And we had an amazingly wonderful, rich, again, slightly crazy life. I was a child actor, for example, for 5 years when I was a kid. And we went to see the opening of the Guggenheim when I was 4 and my brother was 3. We drove from Philadelphia to New York to see the opening of the Guggenheim. That was just the sort of thing that my parents thought made a lot of sense to do. So I personally had a wonderful, vivid childhood. But I think also being the oldest sister of 6 meant that I was very conscious of what the younger children were like and how interesting they were. And in some sense, how much people outside didn't appreciate how interesting and smart and just fascinating they were.
Do you have a moment in time being the oldest of 6 as a keen, obviously a keen observer, and that I'm sure you would say that translates in many ways to your current adult life, but as a keen observer from very young people at a very young age, is there a moment, was there something in observing your siblings that you can think back to that's like, wow, that's just fascinating to me. I'm in awe of that, or something that struck you early on?
Well, actually, it's funny because the moment that I can remember most vividly was that I was actually reading philosophy. So I'm an affiliate professor in philosophy, and my first degree was actually in philosophy. And when I was about 10 or 11, I read Plato's Apology with I read Plato's Phaedo, which is one of the dialogues where he talks about the fact that people would have to exist in another world, another Platonic universe before and after this life, because after all, it doesn't make any sense to think that we just have this limited existence in the world and nothing comes before and nothing comes after. And what struck me in that conversation was that it just seemed obvious to me that a way that you continued on in the world was through your children, that you had children, that you raised children, that each generation of children was going on in the world. And it was amazing to me that for these incredibly smart philosophers who I tremendously admired, like Socrates, the possibility of even thinking about children didn't even show up in that dialogue. And I can remember being very struck by the fact, like, what was wrong with these guys? Why weren't they going to the obvious answer, which was thinking about the way that children make you immortal and extend you into the future and the past? And that reaction was a reaction that has really shaped the whole rest of my career. It's been, look, here's this deep, important, interesting question. It's just obvious that children are going to be able to tell you something about it. And yet the attitude towards children for all those years, even when people were sort of abstractly interested, was that they were part of the world of women and domestic life and were part of the sort of serious intellectual philosophical universe.
I love one of the ways that you phrase this, and I had so many aha moments going through your world. Babies are like the research and development operation or arm of the human species. I mean, this is where it starts.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you actually spend time sitting and watching babies, another vivid moment that I remember was when I was in my first year of graduate school, which is a wonderful time for anyone. Andrew Maltzoff, who became a famous developmental psychologist and was a young fellow graduate student, I guess I was just turned 20. We were sitting in a field looking at a bunch of babies who were just crawling around on picnic blankets in a field the way that babies do. And we just counted up how many experiments does a baby do in the course of the 5 minutes that we were watching them. And I highly recommend this. It's a really fascinating exercise. Just take, anybody under the age of 3 and just watch them for 10 minutes and count how many things they find out about, how many things they think about, how many things they try, just in that tiny brief period of time, and then compare that to how many new ideas or new discoveries you have in the course of maybe 5 years. And the babies, it's pretty clear that the babies are finding out more about the world in 5 minutes than most of us do in 5 years. And I think that's actually a really important biological fact about who we are as humans.
I like to tell people all the time that I'm a big baby, and not like in some weak way, but really because I try every day. And I think I'm very lucky with this podcast to talk to people like yourself. It keeps me fresh. It keeps things open. It doesn't close doors. Every time I get on this show, I'm like, wow, that was amazing. I can't believe they dedicated their life to that. And then I get to pick their mind and see something really interesting that I never even considered.
Well, one of the ideas that I've been working on most recently, is the idea that there's this kind of basic tension. You see it in neuroscience, you see it in computer science, you see it in technology. There's this basic tension between what people call exploration and exploitation. You're trying to solve a problem. One thing to do is to look around and try and explore as many different possible solutions as you possibly can. Another thing is to narrow in on 1 or 2 solutions and really implement them, really make them happen. And I think it's important that you need to do both. So we would not want to have a world where everyone was like a 4-year-old, for one thing, because a bunch of other people would have to be taking care of that 4-year-old. There's something to be said for these adult skills of focus and narrow attention and executive function and planning and all the things that we're very good at doing in adults, the things that the production and marketing divisions, as it were, are doing. But all of that wouldn't have nearly as much potency if we didn't also have both individual people or times in our lives or developmental periods when instead we could just be exploring. We could just be finding out new things for the hell of it. We could just be curious. Here at Berkeley, there's just a lovely new study that some of my colleagues in AI have done where they took one of these very powerful machine learning algorithms and they just gave it curiosity. They added a bit that said, okay, when you're trying to solve these problems, just go out and try and get more information for the sake of more information. And it looks as if that would be counterproductive, right? You're supposed to be solving a problem. You're not supposed to be just going around and trying to find out more about the world. But it turns out that that kind of system is actually more effective than a system that's just narrowly focused on accomplishing particular goals. And I think that's the function that preschoolers play for us. And if you sit down next to a preschooler and just watch them for a while, one of the great pleasures of developmental psychology is you can actually see that happen. You can see it unfold before your eyes.
I've got a ton of questions here. I want to dive at the child level, but I think it'd be very useful for the audience for you to give the big picture, and the term I want to use from your world and many of your peers' world, life history. And why don't you explain life history from your perspective and perhaps contrast that life history to other animals, like other primates? We're kind of very different, us humans, aren't we?
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting. If you go and you talk to evolutionary biologists, one of the ideas that they come back to again and again is the idea of life history. Life history is the way that an organism develops over its entire lifespan. So not just what's the organism like at its peak, as it were, but how long a period of childhood does it have? How long does it live? When does it reproduce? When does it become senescent? When does it die? That profile, that trajectory, turns out to be a really, really important factor in lots of arguments in evolutionary biology. And if you can imagine biologists from Alpha Centauri coming to Earth 150,000 years ago and looking at these new creatures that had just evolved, these little funny primates scurrying around on the belt and trying to figure out what's special about these creatures, what makes them distinctive, the thing that would leap out at her is, my goodness, these creatures have a really bizarre life history, because what she would have noticed is that human beings have twice as long a childhood, twice as long a period of immaturity as any of our closest relatives. So chimpanzees are producing as much food as they're consuming by the time they're 7. Even in hunter-gatherer cultures, we aren't doing that till we're 15. And, my son is 30 and we're still writing tuition checks and writing tuition and rent checks when they're 30. Now, that seems paradoxical. Why would you set up a species so that there's this long period when they're not producing anything, and worse than that, they're actually requiring all these resources from us just to keep them alive? So it's a very distinctive, striking thing about us. And if you compare us to, say, chimpanzees, to our closest primate relatives, we seem to have a lot of other adaptations designed just to deal with that long period of immaturity. So we have pair bonding. We have males and females who are close and who take care of children together. Only 5% of all mammals have pair bonding. We have what anthropologists call alloparenting, which means that we have non-biological kin who are helping to take care of babies. And we have my own personal favorite, namely grandmothers. So another really strange thing about our life history, again, very distinctive, is that we have females who are living past menopause. And we in general live to our 70s as opposed to chimps who live to their 50s. So not only do we have this long extra period early in life, we have this long extra period later in life. So all that seems very puzzling. And it's striking because when you look at lots and lots and lots of other animals, not just primates, not even just mammals, but say birds and even insects, you see this relationship between how long a childhood a species has and how smart and flexible and good at learning they are as adults. So there seems to be some connection between this life history, this long childhood, and then these very distinctive capacities that we have as adults for flexibility and learning.
That starts to get right at the heart of the matter, where I was so fascinated with your work. And you're getting at, okay, if we have this long period where young people are developing and they really can't take care of themselves, and perhaps the rest of adult society is constantly thinking, well, they're not, they're just there, they're not doing much. En contraire, they are doing quite a lot. And I would love for you to explain the expression. I find it fascinating. It dovetails right into my world, at least the Bayesian part. But Bayesian babies, these babies are doing quite a bit. And it is, you just read this for the first time, you're like, wow.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, one of the things that psychologists have said for a while, my colleague Danny Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for saying this, is people are really bad at doing probability and statistics. And it's true that adults are very bad at doing probability and statistics if you actually give them a statistical problem. But it turns out that even 8-month-olds are actually extremely good at doing probability and statistics, and they can do pretty sophisticated kinds of Bayesian inference, but they do it unconsciously. They do it without knowing that that's what they're doing. And what we've been doing in my lab over the last 15 years or so is just giving children problems to solve that from the child's perspective are just a problem like, look, here's this machine and I'm putting blocks on it and tell me how the machine works. Sometimes the machine lights up, sometimes it doesn't. What's happening? How can you make the machine work? That's a very simple, practical thing that babies and children are very excited about doing. But it turns out that with that very simple kind of setup, you can show that the children are actually doing really sophisticated kinds of analyses of the data and ways of combining the data. Some interesting experiments that we've recently done. The preschoolers are actually in some ways better at doing that than adults, in the sense that the preschoolers actually take the data more into consideration. The adults seem to be designed to rely more heavily on what they already know. It really takes a lot of new data to change an adult's mind. Whereas for the children who know less to begin with, they know less to begin with, and they also seem to be designed to really pay attention to the data that's around them. That's the thing that's most important for them. The children seem to be able to do things like use conditional probabilities to infer causal structure from the time they're 2 or 3 years old, which is, I agree, is really, really amazing. And only one of the amazing things that have come out of work in developmental psychology over the last 30 years or so.
When you say that, the ability, the conditional probability ability as a very, very young child. Now, some people might be thinking, and I made the compliment to you at the top, I said, you must have had a great parenting system, great family life. And you said you gave a great story. Some people might be thinking, well, gosh, that's only if. It's not for all kids. Speak to the issue, though, of that, the economic issue, children that come from the wrong side of the tracks. They don't have all the advantages. Speak to that. It becomes it's the nature-nurture issue.
One of the things that we know, and again, this kind of goes with the whole life history perspective, is that you can only have that period of exploration if you also have a protected, nurturing environment. And there's at least some evidence with non-human animals that Animals who are stressed early in life, for example, seem to mature more quickly. So we're sort of forced into that adult state more quickly than animals who are nurtured. But I think it's important to say that nurturance, it means having people around you who love you and care for you. It doesn't mean having people who are putting you in, mini Harvard preschool, or it doesn't mean people who are going out and giving you flashcards. In fact, there's some interesting recent studies that suggest that when children are in a pedagogical situation where they feel as if they're being taught, that actually narrows the range of options they can consider. It actually makes them explore less. And we actually recently published a study just this year, 2017. We were curious about this. So we actually went to look at children in Head Start programs in Oakland. And we also looked at children who were growing up in low-income parts of Lima, Peru, sort of in the favelas in the suburbs of Lima. And we thought, well, maybe these children are going to have more trouble with the causal inference tests than the children in the middle-class preschools. What we discovered was, if anything, it was just the opposite. Especially these children in Peru were doing incredibly well on these causal tests. And the children in Head Start, even though they do worse if you do a formal IQ test, for example, they do worse on executive function tests. We were sort of surprised by how good they were, as good or better than the middle-class kids at solving these kind of spontaneous learning tests. Now, remember, from the kids' perspective, this isn't learning, it's not school, it's just here's a cool toy to play with and you're trying to figure out how it works. But I think it's important to say that the kids that we were looking at, both in Peru and in Head Start, are kids who are low income, but who have parents who care enough about them to make sure that they get into Head Start programs or into these schools in Peru. So I think it's important to say that the kids need this kind of nurturant, supportive, extended family environment, which is what they have in Peru. I think that kids are not going to do well on these things in situations of stress, violence, isolation, the situations in which very many children in America, by the way, are growing up. But it isn't as if what children need is to have the middle-class parent who's hovering over them and making sure that they, do their worksheets.
I have a side question for you about your personality, your perspective, your purpose as I listen to you. Why are you so passionate?
One thing about the kind of work that I do is that I'm with kids a lot of the time. Not actually quite as much time as I'd like, but a lot of the time. And, there are some kinds of projects, some kinds of professions where you do something because you think it's important abstractly, but you don't have an immediate sense of it being important every day. And one of the nice things about working with kids is you get to see the kids, and it hits you over the head every time you see a 3-year-old, just how smart and interesting and open to the world they actually are. And I think, one of the questions that people often ask is, well, as an adult, how can you keep this very open sense of exploration and possibility that children have? And I think actually having children, hanging out with children is a really important part of that. And I think even though we kind of give lip service to, yes, the children are our future and children are important, it's still true that, I've given talks at, for example, and it is true that if you're in a room full of people and you say that you study children, you can kind of see the glazing. Yeah. At least you used to see the eyes glazing over. That's not quite so true anymore, because I think people are starting to realize just how important this early period is. But it's a bit ironic that the way they realized it was because economists started telling them that there were going to be really good returns on investment. Whereas I think for me, it was sitting in the room with 3-year-olds, it was pretty obvious.
When you open up Pandora's box and you start talking about Bayesian babies and conditional probabilities, that room full of suits that doesn't think they want to listen might all of a sudden go, what did she just say? Hold on, I better pay attention.
Well, one of the really exciting things that's happening just at this moment is that if you look at the AI community, one of the things that people have really realized, part of the new excitement about artificial intelligence, comes because people are starting to make systems that can learn. That's been the real advances have all been in machine learning. But the people who are doing that work, I think, are starting to realize they're really bumping up against the limits of the kinds of learning that machines have done so far. And they're realizing that every 3- and 4-year-old can solve problems, can learn things that you can't get a standard, even, a wonderful deep learning algorithm with enormous amounts of data. They can't do things that every 3- and 4-year-old can do. So they're getting to be very excited about talking to cognitive development people and learning about cognitive development. I'm teaching a course this year at Berkeley called Cognitive Development for Computer Scientists. the students and indeed a lot of the faculty are computer scientists who want to know how is it that, babies and young children are the best learners that we know of in the world. If learning is going to turn out to be the key thing in AI, we should really be looking at these kids. So there's this kind of nice thing about having all these nerdy eats guys suddenly saying, "Gee, babies and children, they're really cool and really interesting."
You hinted about it earlier, talking about the playground and observing babies. But let's talk about play for a moment. If you were to open up with that room and start talking about play, a lot of the suits might say, "Oh my gosh, I have to leave." But on the flip side, if people pay attention and start to say, "Hold on, let's really think about play. Let's try and put ourselves back at that point in time." One great thing about play is, Mike, you feel good. Why don't you talk about some of the bigger picture benefits there that we can learn from childhood play?
Well, play is another one of those sort of evolutionarily paradoxical phenomena, because not just humans, but all young animals play. And it's characteristic of young animals rather than older animals. And of course, the very definition of play is that play is doing a bunch of things that aren't actually going to have immediate benefits. So it seems like a kind of paradox. Why is it that for so many species, we spend so much time doing things just for fun? And the thought is that the sort of for fun is a way of getting a reward for this kind of wide-ranging exploration. The kind of paradox, which I think people are familiar with, is, sometimes if you're trying too hard to do something, that actually keeps you from doing it. And pulling back and just exploring and having fun actually makes you more effective in the long run. So it's this kind of paradox, which is to actually get things done in the long run. Often in the short run, you have to release yourself from the pressure of trying to get things done. And play seems to serve that function in the animal kingdom. And the kinds of play that we do reflect the kinds of things that we need to do as adults. So, for example, baby rats wrestle and fight. So they do all sorts of play fighting. And the interesting thing is, if you look at, with rats, unlike children, you can actually do the experiment where you see what's the difference between the ones who get to play when they're young and the ones who don't. It isn't any one specific thing that they do, but it's how flexible and resilient they are, how good they are at changing, doing something different quickly in a new context. And that seems to be the general story. So if you just want to do one specific thing and do it well, then the best thing to do is just train a system to do that one specific thing well. But if you want to be resilient, if you want to be able to face a new problem that you've never seen before and be able to do something intelligent about it, then it turns out that playing around actually helps. There's some wonderful work by a roboticist called Todd Lipson, and he was designing a robot that had a period to begin with where it just kind of messed around. It just kind of did silly dances, basically. It played with its own body. And it turned out that the advantage of that period of play was that then if you cut off the robot's leg, it could figure out how to walk even without the leg. So a robot that was just trained to walk could be really good at walking, but if you change the situation, if you cut off a leg or you put it in a new room, it would fall apart. Whereas this robot who'd gotten the chance to play could adjust to a new circumstance, a new situation. And of course, that's what we human beings are better at doing than anything else. That's our great evolutionary niche. We're the ones who are really adapted. The way I put it sometimes is we're adapted to the unknown unknowns. The unknown unknowns, that's where we live. That's our environment. That's the environment that we do best in. And of course, there's more and more unknown unknowns as we've gone on in history.
But what's amazing is the way your work maps this out. And I get back to the Bayesian babies comment and what you're talking about, test, adjust, test, adjust. The younger we are generally, and bell curve wise, that's easier. It happens more. And then we get older and we don't test, adjust anymore. We come up with an idea and we stick with it. And if new things come into our field of vision that invalidate that direction or that idea or that hypothesis, we just keep going. We don't adjust to the new information. I don't know that I'm special in any way, but I feel like I adjust very well. And I'm constantly observing other adults that don't seem to have the ability to adjust anymore. And it always strikes me every time I see it.
Well, again, I think it's important to say, as you can probably tell from listening to me, I'm very pro 4-year-old, and I love 4-year-olds, and I love being in that wild, explore, creative side. But the truth is that there's a genuine trade-off between that and then the ability to actually get things done, to actually execute things, to actually make things happen. And to some extent, if you want to make things happen, you have to ignore a lot of distractions. You can't readjust your strategy every time there's something new. And the great challenge is, how do you go back and forth between exploring, between finding out things that are new, taking new information into account, and actually being focused enough to be able to do the thing that you want to do. One way that you could think of it is, even if you think about it from the perspective of neuroscience, it's as if there are some parts of your brain, sort of roughly speaking, the back of your brain, that is really designed to hold lots of different possibilities, lots of different possible ways of thinking about how the world is. But the trouble is, when you act, you don't get to, sort of do 30% of one policy and 70% of another policy. You just have to choose one policy and follow through. I think the way that people solve this, sometimes in computer science, the way neuroscience seems to have solved it, the way evolutionary biology seems to have solved it, is by having these kind of alternating periods, a period of play, exploration, being protected from the immediate environment, and then a period of taking the things that you've learned in that play and exploration and putting them to use. Or sometimes a division of labor of different people with different personalities and different strengths and weaknesses. So people who are really good at general exploration and people who are really good at actually implementing things and making things happen. If you are like me, if you're a scientist, for example, I think there's this constant, probably the hardest thing about being a scientist is this constant tension between, let's think of a really crazy high-risk idea, but wait a minute, there's 50 crazy high-risk ideas. How can I decide which is the one that I should actually turn into an experiment? And how can I decide how to balance the crazy high-risk ideas and the ones that are maybe not quite such high risk but are more likely to succeed? That's a very hard, challenging thing to do, but I think it's the secret of being a successful scientist, being a successful innovator.
You keep bringing up 4-year-olds. And so you're forcing me, as we have this conversation, to think the last time that I was around a 4-year-old a lot. And it was my nephew. And so, okay, in my family, there's an assortment of nephews and nieces, all teens now. So I'm having to go back a decade in time. But now, as they're all in their teens, one of them is perhaps the best athlete in the community. And he's just exceptional. And I always hear these generalizations from adults. They're like, well, he just happens to be better, this or that. But I have a very distinct memory of when this boy was 4 years old. We would go to his brother's t-ball games or whatever. His brother's a little bit older. This one little boy, who's the exceptional athlete now, at 4 years of age, I would say to him, hey, I'll give you $1 if you run around the field. It was approximately maybe 3/4 of a mile. This 4-year-old boy would run around the field perhaps 8 to 10 times during the game just to collect $1 from me. Now, what we as adults, we look back now as he's a teen and he's an exceptional athlete, and we'd say, oh, wow, he's just, perhaps some adults just say, well, it's just natural, whatever. And I look back to the 4-year-old time and I say, you know what? That kid had a plan. He knew what he was doing at 4 and he had a plan. Maybe he couldn't describe it. Maybe he didn't know exactly what it was, but that kid had a plan.
Well, I think there's one of the things that's interesting is you can see all of these individual differences in what kinds of things different children think are fascinating and interesting and worth exploring. And I think the secret is when you see children, the things that children get most excited about, the things that are the things that they really feel that they're exploring and that they can master. And that can be really different for different children. One of the things that's interesting, you mentioning your nephew being a teenager, one of the things that we've just started working on now is the idea that adolescence may be a kind of revived period of plasticity. So adolescence may be another time when this kind of possibility and exploration happens. And the traditional picture of adolescence has always been this very negative one. How can we keep them from getting into terrible trouble all the time? And that's a real problem. But increasingly, there's more and more evidence that adolescents are actually exploring more. And in the studies, I mentioned that we did these studies that showed that the preschoolers were actually more exploratory than the adults. Now, that was about a physical problem. That was a problem about a machine and how you put blocks on a machine to make it go. But we also did that with a social problem. Why is this person acting the way that they are? And what we discovered there was that the adolescents were actually the most flexible. So the preschoolers were very flexible. They got less flexible in school age. The adults weren't very flexible in the way they thought about why someone could do what they did. But the adolescents were paying an awful lot of attention to the data rather than the priors, to put it in a Bayesian way, when the problem was about human action and social relationships. So it seems as if that might be a kind of extra burst of exploration that happens with teenagers.
I would be amiss in the limited time that I have with you still if I did not get your perspective, some greatest hits of perspectives that you might have on some issues of the day that people can perhaps relate to. Not too long ago, James Damore at Google was let go, and he had a certain perspective that he wrote down. He was let go. Could you, in a nutshell, explain his perspective, and then perhaps your perspective of that perspective, and how maybe we all kind of missed the real important issue in that debate?
One of the general things that happen that you come up against as a developmental psychology, one of the questions that's always seemed to be a really fundamental question is how much of anything that we do is the result of nature or nurture, or how much is it the result of genes and how much is it the result of environment. It's a very natural way of thinking about it, is to act as if, okay, there's one set of forces, nature, genes, biology, and then there's this other set of forces, nurture, parents, environment, teaching, culture. And you could kind of just treat them as if they're a vector, and you just figure out how much of one force is coming in and how much of another force is coming to shape the way that people turn out. And then you could say, okay, well, 35% of this is nature and 65 is nurture, or however the numbers would work out. That's such a natural way of thinking about it. It's very seductive, and there are even, smart popular psychologists who talk that way. But it's totally wrong from a scientific perspective. It's one of those cases where, sort of like our everyday physics turns out to be totally wrong from the perspective of scientific physics. It isn't even, people sometimes say it's not even wrong. It's just the whole wrong way of asking the question. And that's certainly true for nature and nurture, and especially for things like the sex differences that Damore was focusing on. So even the idea that there's a male brain and a female brain, or that there's a male piece that comes from nature versus nurture, just doesn't, it's the wrong categories. It's the kind of category mistake. And there are lots of examples of this. If you look at actual development, what you see is that, from the moment that there's a fertilized egg, the nature and nurture are interacting. And not only are they interacting, but they're interacting in all of these complex, nonlinear, feedback-driven kinds of ways. So it's just not a good question to ask, are women naturally more suited to tech than, naturally less suited to tech than men? That naturally just doesn't mean anything from a developmental perspective. The way I put it, Larry Summers famously got into trouble for making these kinds of arguments as an economist, and I always feel as if, my reaction to Larry Summers doing that is, it's as if I went to Larry Summers and said, Larry, look, here's my idea about economics. We just need to find the right price for things. And if we just find the right price and we make sure that everyone is selling everything at the price that's the natural price for that particular commodity, then the economy will work well. Now, that's kind of not even wrong. That's just not getting the most basic things about how economics works, even though for many thousands of years, that was the natural way that people thought about economics and money. And it's kind of like that with the nature, nurture, gender, nature, or nurture kinds of disputes. It's not even the right category for thinking about the problem.
Damore put that out there, and then you hear all the reactions on assorted sides. You're saying we need to take a step back and let's think about this as a scientist, and then you're not left with such black and white answers.
I mean, it's not even just not black and white. It's that let me give you an example of one of the studies that I talked about in my column in the journal after the Damore thing came out. This is a neuroscience study. So one of the things that people talk about is, well, male brains and female brains are different. And it turns out that, in fact, there are various kinds of brain measures. And on average, you'll see a difference between men and women on these particular kinds of brain measures. And that led people to think, okay, there's a kind of naturally male brain and a naturally female brain. But it turns out that if you actually look at the correlation among those features, there isn't any correlation. So most people will score really high in the male direction on some brain parts and really high in the female direction on other brain parts. the term that neuroscientists use is that it's a kind of mosaic. There are different kinds of features, and even though when you average together large numbers of people, it might look as if there's a difference, any individual person is going to be this really complicated mosaic of different kinds of features in different brain areas. And the same thing's true about people's psychological capacities. The other thing is that there's, as we say in psychology, much more within group variance than between group variance. So there's much more difference, even if there's a little bit of difference in the overlaps. There's much more difference among different women and different men than there is between men as a group and women as a group. And again, even if you just look at the very physical fact of being biologically male or biologically female, it turns out that, you might say, well, of course, that's just determined by your genes. But it turns out, actually, there's a very long, complicated, bidirectional set of things that happen from the moment that you have a particular set of chromosomes to the moment that you end up with, female or male genitalia, let alone a brain that has particular characteristics. So it's taking something that's really complicated and making it simple in a way that speaks to, social categories rather than really speaks to the biology, in particular speaks to development. Another point that I think is important to make is very often people act as if something's in your brain, it must be there innately and it must be genetic. And of course, that's not true either. So even if I took a whole bunch of adult men and women and discovered that their brains were different, that's what I'd expect, given that their behaviors are different, given that their social status is different. Of course, their brains are going to be different. The question is, what happened from the time that they were a zygote that led to those differences later on?
See, what's so fun about hearing you explain that, I don't know your politics. It's not relevant to this conversation, but you are diving deep with your training, your skills, your experience, and you're laying it out there in such a way that everyone has to pay attention and say, okay, I have to consider what Allison is saying there because, perhaps I didn't know that. I have to go down that path too. And it's such a contrast to modern life where we do take things and put them into partisan silos immediately when it's just all damn complicated, isn't it?
Well, this is part of the reason why I and, other people who've been on your podcast, I think there's a real tension for scientists about when we go out into the world at large. We can't tell the whole story in all its detail and complexity in, 700 words in the Wall Street Journal or even an hour-long podcast. And I think there's a lot of back and forth about, are we oversimplifying? Can we represent the science in a really good way? But I think we're kind of, we don't have a choice. People are going to be having beliefs and making decisions based on what they think the science is, whether the scientists are conveying it properly or not. So we really have, it's not as if we don't do it, somebody else isn't going to be doing it. I think in my field of developmental psychology, that's really vivid. There's no FDA on parenting books. Anybody who wants to can go out and write a book and say, look, if you do this to your children, then they're going to come out great and go to Harvard. There's nobody to stop that except real developmental psychologists trying to say something about what the science really says.
Let's keep it at the developmental level for a moment on something relatively new, because I still recall in the summer of 1995, Netscape went public. That was kind of like the ignition switch. And now roll forward to 2018. And if I give an iPhone to a 3-year-old, their fingers start moving like freaking Mozart. Have you done work, I'm assuming you have started to investigate, what are we starting to see with the early tech in the hands of children? What are some of the big picture lessons and insights that we are learning for good and bad?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. And it's funny because this is one of the examples where everybody thinks they know what the answer to that question is. Apparently, including some of the big funders for Apple, everyone is convinced that this is terrible and that screens are going to destroy children's minds and that we need to keep them away from children and so on and so forth. It's amazing how deep the conviction is given how completely missing the data is. So, and of course, if you think about it, you said yourself, right? 1995 was Netscape. The first iPhone is now 10, 11 years ago. We're scientists. It takes us 15 years to do any kind of study, let alone try to figure out what the long-term consequences of something are going to be that only happened 10 years ago. But scientists are starting to do that. And my take is, if you look at the big picture, part of what adolescents and children have always been about is about they're the ones who do the technological innovation, whether that technological innovation is putting a new design on a pot or figuring out a new way of throwing a spear or figuring out a new way of organizing your life or having a train or having a telegraph. They're the ones who are always sort of on the cutting edge of that kind of technological change. And in some sense, the function of those children is to be on the cutting edge of technological change. Now, this time may be different from all the other times, but it seems like every time that happens, the previous generation is convinced that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and whatever this thing is. For Socrates, for example, it was actually reading. He thought that reading was a really terrible idea. It was going to mean that nobody remembered anything anymore, and it was also going to mean that people would think anything written in a book, it was true. And of course, he was right. People don't remember all of Homer anymore. People do tend to think that things that are written down are true. But on balance, we feel like the advantages of having writing and reading outweigh the disadvantages. And my guess is that's what's going to happen with the new technologies as well. We'll figure out how to both deal with the positive and the negative sides of them. And the experience for the next generation of children is going to be, the children who have been doing this from the time they were 2 is going to be really different from the kind of disruptive, distracting experience that it is for us as adults. Now, I don't know that that's true. It might be that 20 years from now, we're going to discover that this is finally the technology that's destroyed us all. But one way I put it is, if you're interested in technologies that will destroy us all, worry about climate change. You know, there's only so many things you can worry about. Climate change, yeah, really worry about that. Don't worry about your kid and his iPhone.
But, you know, it's like, I think about you think about the tech, we can say, okay, what are all the disadvantages? I can just like sum them up in my mind. I can say, okay, maybe my eyes have gotten a little worse than they would have at this age by using the screens too much. You know, I see some adults where they've got literally a hunchback from looking at the phones. Maybe people are taking too many selfies and there's too much of that going on. But, you know, I think about from the research standpoint and the ability to connect with people, the puzzle-like thrust of all this technology, finding any piece of information, especially for those people that have the curiosity in them and they want to go check out Allison and find your site and start digging through your papers and look at all this work that this lady has done for decades before we got there, and it gives you a head start. That kind of thing. I don't know how any of us can say that's bad.
It's kind of interesting if you look at when printing first started, reading or printing or just about any kind of technological innovation. Printing is a really interesting one. There's a wonderful book about the French Revolution and the Ancien Regime, and it points out that when printing first became really widespread and you could have a lot of cheap printing, the first thing that happened was that the world was full of terrible scandal and libel and polemics and pornography and all the kind of rubbish that you see on the net now. That was what a lot of the first printed pamphlets were like. And it took a while for things to sort of sort themselves out and figure out a way for people to sort through this amazing new source of information. But again, I don't think anyone would look back and say, oh, printing, that was a really terrible idea. Being able to actually have books that were easy and cheap to produce, that was really awful and led to the end of civilization as we know it. And in fact, if you think about it, my own personal example is if you think about the 19th century, think about the telegraph and the train. The truth is nothing technological that we've done in the last 100 years has had the same kind of impact that the telegraph and the train did. So for thousands of years, the fastest you could go was the speed of a fast horse. And then suddenly, literally, information could travel at the speed of light. That was a gigantic transformation, and it had good effects and it had bad effects. Now we look back and we think, oh, isn't that quaint and sweet and how lovely to be riding on a train? People at the time were convinced that trains were going to completely destroy the world. In a way they did. They destroyed the world of the 18th century. And I think the new tech in some ways is going to destroy the world of the 20th century, and it's going to be up to the next generation of children to build the world of the 21st century. One way I put it is, it seems to be universally true that the day before you were born is always Eden, and the day after your children are born is Mad Max. That seems to have been true for all of history.
As we go out, let me leave with something, a great line of yours that you've used many times, which I love. And you talk about what's it like to be a baby, being in love in Paris for the first time after you've had 3 double espressos. Why don't you let the audience know how that one came to be and what you really mean when you say that?
One of the big philosophical questions that we can ask about babies, and I talk about this a lot in my second book, The Philosophical Baby, is what's it like to be a baby? What's consciousness like in babies? And again, those philosophers who didn't think very much of babies for all those years often said, well, babies don't have very much consciousness. In fact, they did operations on babies, very young babies, without anesthesia for a while because they thought that they didn't have feeling, didn't have consciousness. No, it's a really hard question to answer. How do you know that anybody has consciousness, let alone how a baby does? But I think when you actually look at the science, the neuroscience and the cognitive science, it suggests that we may have a really different kind of consciousness when we're babies. The way I like to put this is it's the difference between the kind of spotlight of consciousness we have as adults, where we pay attention to one thing and it's very vivid and everything else around you kind of goes dark, and thinking about the child's consciousness as being more like a lantern. It's more like something that's illuminating the whole world. We know that some of the chemicals in things like nicotine and caffeine seem to have the effect of leading to this broader plasticity, leading to a brain that changes more easily. And we know that putting yourself in the position of a baby, like going to a new place, has the same kind of effect. Consciousness gets to be much more vivid and intense, even if your practical ability to get through the world really gets damaged. So you put all that together, and being in a new state, in a new place, like being in Paris for the first time, and having all these changes to your neurotransmitters that are making them more open and plastic, that sounds a lot like being in Paris after you've had a bunch of double espressos. And as I point out, that is kind of a wonderful way to be. But it does mean that you tend to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning crying, which may be the way it feels to be a baby.
I implore the audience to check out, too. You've got a great TED Talk out there, I think 3 million plus views, but you get into this a little bit more where you've got an example and you dig in. I'm not going to ask you here now. People can go check it out. But you get into something with broccoli and crackers and babies, and I highly recommend people to go check that out for one of those aha moments of like, wow, that's a really cool revelation. Hey, listen, where's the best place we can send people to, Allison? I mean, they can quickly check out your Wikipedia link, and there are papers that go back a long time. You've got many, many books. You're easily found. Would you like to direct people to anywhere?
Well, if you go to my website, which is AllisonGopnik.com, that's got links to the books, and it's got links to my research papers and to some of the popular things like the Wall Street Journal columns and my writing in other places as well. That's probably the best kind of Gopnik Central, the best Gopnik Central place to start. And if you look, there's a section in there called Memoirs that has some stories about what my life was like growing up, and if you're interested in that as well. So that AllisonGopnik.com is probably the best place to start, and that will give you an idea. The other good place to start is my first book, The Scientist in the Crib, which was very much designed to be a kind of all-purpose introduction to this new world of developmental psychology. Or the most recent one, The Gardener and the Carpenter, which is really about these questions, these practical questions about how do we take all this new science, what does it tell us about being a parent, and both being individual parents and what we should think of as states and societies trying to make decisions about children. So those are both two good places to start.
So, I asked and you said, the energy, the passion from being around 4-year-olds. I'm going to have to take you at your word on that. But I have to say, you've inspired me because I like to think of myself as a pretty energetic guy. But I say to myself now, my gosh, as I move forward in the next bunch of decades, assuming I've got those decades, why not stay energized and excited, right? All this boring, placid stuff, that's no fun. You want to have the energy every morning. Do you ever wake up in a morning not excited? There is no way the person that I'm talking to right now ever wakes up and is not excited. Is that true?
I can tell you one thing. I have 3 grandchildren who are the complete joy of my life. And my one practical piece of advice to people is skip the children, just go straight to the grandchildren. I take care of them about once a week. In the morning, when those little faces show up, it's the most exciting, wonderful, great thing in the entire world. By about 9 o'clock, when they're ready to go to sleep, I am really worn out. So if you saw me at the end of a full day of engaging with a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old. There are certainly moments when all that thinking and seeing and engaging in the world can wear you out, but it's well worth it for the day of inspiration. And it is actually true that, if I think about that day versus the working faculty meeting going, filling out the forms, answering emails kinds of days, there's no question that feels like a much better day to be human on.
Allison, I appreciate you taking the time today. Great insights. I could probably pick your mind for hours, but I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks. Happy to talk to you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.